say that there are aspects to our experienced consciousness, which is different from how machines work, and therefore machines will always be short. There is no neural correlate to consciousness. So our past is also malleable, and which is totally unlike how computers work. A lot of false information can also propagate very quickly because of social media, but it also gives the tools that one needs for insights and valid information to be shared by a lot of people. Because of AI, pervasive automation, the world doesn't need 8 billion people anymore.
Right.
The population of the world is going to collapse. So this whole problem of human disruption of the climate or the crisis will not be the big story. Or what one would need is a new way of credentialing and accessing curated information. The belief systems that people have held on to for a long time will all be jettisoned.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the KVKurious Podcast. Our guest for today is Professor Subhash Kak, who is a Padma Shri awardee, a professor of computer science at the Oklahoma State University, a history revisionist, and notable for his idea on instantaneously trained neural networks. In this conversation, we speak about how the world could look like with AI advancing at the pace it is. What historical or Indic scientific references do we have to sort of predict what consciousness is and if AI can ever be conscious, and much more. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Professor Subhash Kak on the KVKurious Podcast. Hi, Professor Subhash. Thank you for joining my podcast. Super honored to be hosting you and looking forward to this conversation where we speak about AI, consciousness, time, Indic history, and much more.
Thank you, Krishna. Delighted to be a part of it.
Sure. Okay, let's start with AI. What's one difference about biological neural networks and artificial neural networks that fascinates you the most? And what about it is important and relevant today?
Well, I started working on neural networks a long time ago, right when the neural network revolution was taking off. And in the early 90s, I came up with a algorithm for instantaneous training of neural networks. And then I did a few other things as well. And the driver, or one of the drivers for my research was this whole question of how is it that consciousness arises in biological neural networks, and it doesn't arise in artificial neural networks, or let's say silicon based or computer based neural networks. And so the question that you ask emerges from this discussion, and that is because and I've written several papers on it in various scientific journals, and you can look at it from so many different perspectives. One is let's say quantum mechanics. Because fundamentally, if you have a biological system, such as our brain, there are underlying quantum mechanical processes, right? And quantum mechanics is associated with paradoxes at the fundamental level, because the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is accepted by most people, it's called the orthodox Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, postulates that reality has two complementary aspects. One is the observed system, and the other is the observer. Or in more accessible terms, you have the physical reality, and then you have consciousness. So consciousness is fundamental to reality. And of course, as we all know, this is identical to what Vedanta says. That's where our Indic connection comes in, and this Indic connection played a role in the ideas of Schrödinger and other pioneers of quantum mechanics. So if you're looking at a machine, you're not expressing its quantum mechanical properties in the gates and so on, which constitute the engine, right? Or the networks, because the engineered systems don't have any issues associated with this divide between the observer and the observed, where what the observer does makes a change in the observed. That is the fundamental thing, the collapse of the quantum state function. So this is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that within our minds, it is, of course, appropriate to say that a lot of what we do is quite similar to what a machine does. Most of what we do is according to standard scripts, or you can even not be paying attention to the road and you will still be able to drive, right? But you are able to sort of pull back into awareness should the need be there. And likewise, when you're walking unconsciously, you're strolling down a path and you're doing it unconsciously. And therefore, that is indeed like what a machine does. And a lot of what activities we do in a bureaucracy or in our daily lives are driven by scripts. And therefore, to that extent, we are machine-like, excepting when we are sort of totally aware of our being. That doesn't happen very often. And maybe that happens when you have a creative episode. You're going through that epiphany, when you see something in a new way outside of the box. Or as Schrodinger in his famous book, What is Life, says that when two lovers or friends, they're looking into each other's eyes, then they are more than just who they were. At that time, their personal awareness is sort of superseded by something larger. So now all that is not possible on a computer, on a machine network, right? Now, of course, we are only talking in terms of analogies. Now, you might say, why should analogies decide what reality is like? But we are using analogies here to say that there are aspects to our experienced consciousness which is different from how machines work, and therefore machines will always be short. Now, another way of looking at it is that if you have a machine, Turing machine, a model of a machine, and you put a program into it, then the program, by intrinsically, you cannot predict as to when it will stop, right? However, we, as biologically aware individuals, no matter what we're doing, we can always suspend a certain chain of thought or a certain sensory sequence and pull back. So in other words, there is within us a kind of a dichotomy. We are within us like machines, but there is a higher executive, so to speak, which is able to pull in and pull out. And that is not within the network. In fact, there is no neural correlate to consciousness, and neuroscientists have done experiments. So that seems to be in another dimension. So, okay, to come back to your question, yes, fundamental differences, and because of these fundamental differences, in my view, computers will never be conscious. Computers will only do what you make them do, according to certain rules. So they can only follow certain rules. While we, as individuals, and certainly our brains, we're always adapting to the environment. The brain's structure and organization changes as it does various tasks. So we are adapting, we are plastic, and our structure responds to the environment into which we are placed. Now, if such computers were built, maybe they could have further aspects. But right now, that's not how computer architecture is envisaged.
Right. So when you say that the mind adapts to something, I want to revisit some points that you mentioned, but since you ended on this note, when you say that the mind adapts to something almost on an instantaneous basis and affects our decision-making abilities, and machines cannot replicate this particular behavior, Isn't this sort of maybe the objective of what you might have envisioned when you speak of instantaneous training neural networks?
Well, instantaneously trained neural networks, the way I thought about it was to put in all the training data and internalize it. But that's not how our brains work. That's not how you view at our behavior from a neuroscience perspective. Because there are two aspects. One is, of course, short-term memory, right? Short-term, we seem to remember everything, but only portions of it are distilled into long-term awareness, right? And so there is some kind of a many-to-one mapping taking place. A reorganization of our past, of our experience also takes place on a continuous basis. Not only that, whatever memories you have, even of your childhood or of yesterday, the more you think of it, the memories themselves change. So our recall of memories itself is an active process. It's not that our past is sort of like a definite,
it's not objective.
Yeah, it's not something where it's completely spelled out. No.
Yeah.
Each time you recall your past, you change it. So our past is also malleable, and which is totally unlike how computers work. So it's not only we are adapting our structure, but we are also adapting our memories and our past as we proceed on. And this is something which is very different from how machines work. And as I mentioned before, if machines were to be envisaged with a totally different architecture and adaptive architecture going beyond the Turing machine model, then possibly you could think of endowing it with certain capabilities which are impossible at this point. But on the other hand, that might turn out to be nothing but a living machine, a living organism, right? So that would be different from how machines exist at this point in time.
Interesting. I'll go back to a point you mentioned within the first answer. You mentioned that there's a state when someone is, let's say, aware of their being, and consciousness is sort of the prerequisite for that awareness to arise. The follow-on question to that would be, what results in the existence of consciousness itself, or what makes consciousness possible?
Well, as someone who's worked both in quantum mechanics and computer science, as well as theories of consciousness, especially from India, in Vedanta, for example, or Kashmir Shaivism. In Vedanta, or the whole Vedic construct of reality is that there is consciousness which transcends physical reality, but also interpenetrates physical reality. All right, so let me step back once again. What is the difference between this view and the mainstream scientific view? In the mainstream scientific view, reality, the physical cosmos, and us is basically different arrangement of objects, right? And in this arrangement of objects, in the brain arises an emergent phenomenon. From the physical objects arises chemistry, from chemistry arises biology, and from biology and network of connections, which is complexity, arises mind and consciousness. This is the mainstream view in neuroscience. The Vedic view or the Indic view is that consciousness transcends. Consciousness is not a material property of any object. In fact, if you read the Vedantic texts like the Brahma Sutras or the Bhagavad Gita, this is precisely what they are about. In fact, you can put them in modern narrative. And what they're saying is that the Atman is distinct from the body, from the Sharir, right? So consciousness interpenetrates the body, but it transcends it. Transcending, what that means is that it's not located in space and time. It's not a material object, right? And because of that, you will then be perceiving reality somewhat differently, or your understanding of what reality is. And of course, lots of things ensue or emerge from this perspective. The whole Indian view, where mind and consciousness are two different things. Mind is an instrument. All our eyes and hearing, etc., they're all instruments. But consciousness transcends them, but also interpenetrates, which of course brings in a lot of paradoxical questions. While in the Western view, mind and consciousness are the same. So when you say, well, this is what I'm doing, you're talking about both of your awareness and the contents of your awareness, right? While in the Indian view, it's different. And I think as someone who's looked at these questions, both from a scientific perspective and other perspectives, I think the Indian view is the deeper one, and it is the correct answer. It is what also explains phenomena such as Srinivasa Ramanujan waking up in the mornings and saying, hey, the goddess Namagiri or Namakal gave me these equations, and I saw them in my dream, and here they are. I don't know where these equations came from. And I say that all creative things, and not just mathematical creative or artistic, even in the business world, even in interactions with individuals, creativity comes in everywhere. They come from a space which is outside of our normal experience, because they require you to go out of your space-time complex associated with your mind. So awareness is different from mind. And I think that's the difference, because unlike, most people don't understand the Indian framework at all. It's been totally misrepresented by Indologists, by academics, not out of malice, but because they were approaching it from the perspective of reality as things, which is the mainstream Western view, whether you're looking at it in science, accepting, of course, the leaders of science. As I said, the creators of quantum mechanics agreed with the Indian view, and they claimed that this is what inspired them to find what they did. But mainstream, the second tier, the third tier, it's still reality as things. And that leads to all kinds of complexes and all kinds of problems, like the current wokeism, which is become such a dominant
rooted
force
in identities.
Yeah, right. Because you're only things. There's nothing more.
Yeah. So, this is also a subject I've read quite a bit about, obviously much lesser than you, given your age and experience. But that being said, I want to, sort of talk about this a bit more. When you say that, okay, let's say consciousness is a phenomena that transcends the physical plane, and it also makes itself available or penetrates through the physical manifestations. What determines to what extent does consciousness penetrate? For instance, why does consciousness play a certain role in Ramanujan's mind, or through Ramanujan, but not equally so through many others? What is this distinguishing factor that makes one physical object more available to consciousness than the others?
Well, everybody, people all over the world, when they see something new, it's the same phenomenon as associated with Ramanujan's claims that he came up with these equations, because clearly there was no background history to those equations, right? Now, all this is described in most clarity within a Vedantic school associated with the place that I come from, namely Kashmir, and it's called Kashmir Shaivism. In Kashmir Shaivism, consciousness is viewed as light. Shiva is also called Prakasha. So Shiva is light, or consciousness is light. So this light illuminates the mind, the contents of the mind, which is, of course, the neural structures in your brain.
So
right?
are we talking light as an electromagnetic light, or is it metaphoric?
No, it's a metaphor.
Okay.
It's a metaphor. It's a light, prakash as a light.
Okay.
So it illuminates the contents of the mind. Now, why might this illumination not work very well? Why are people in a kind of a fog, right? Because even each one of us, sometimes you wake up and you don't see things well, while there are certain other times when you see things much more clearly in your daily interactions, transactions with the rest of the world, right? So in this framework, Kashmir Shaivism, which is really totally Vedic or Vedantic, it's a form, it's a school of Vedanta. What is claimed is that there are certain limitations that arise on your awareness. And these limitations, which in Sanskrit are called kanchukas, these are like a fog, You know, you have light. Of course, we're using metaphors. You have light, which is illuminating our mind. But if there's a fog, then that illumination is not very strong, right? And this fog is a consequence of things such as ego or associations that you're familiar with. You know, if all knowledge is also limiting. Knowledge is like, you know, the horse, in order to make sure that the horse doesn't get startled, has blinkers, right? The horse with harness to a cart. So it's got blinkers on the sides of the eyes. So it only sees the road. So likewise, our training, or to use a Sanskrit word, sanskaras, which educate us, which give us insights, also limit our view. Then you can only see the world as you've been trained. All education is also limiting. All education ultimately puts you into a prison. You go to school and college, then you can't see beyond what has been drilled into your head, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, there is a distinction between bookish knowledge. So this, in fact, the sutra in Kashmir Shaivism is Vidya Bandha. The Vidya meaning bookish knowledge itself is become a binding, and you can't see freely. So ultimately, the whole question is, how do you connect to intuition? Intuition is that point between that mediating this prakash, this light, and your normal mind experiences, which are machine-like. You know, you got to see this distinction. And this intuition, if you have access to it, then you can navigate through that fog. But most people, in fact, I have a column which I write in Medium, and I call it The Power of the Story.
Mm-hmm.
And there I argue, you know, I start off by saying that if you've been to a pet store where you can adopt these stray dogs, and you may have seen them in malls and possibly in India and Bangalore as well. So you see these dogs in cages looking beseechingly at people who pass by. They want to be adopted. You know, they put their eyes into your eyes. They want to be adopted. Human beings are also like that. In fact, in the Rig Veda, there's a statement which says that there are two kinds of pashus, dvipadas and chatushpadas, bipeds and quadrupeds. Quadrupeds are the animals that we are familiar with, right? Horses, cows, etc. Bipeds are humans. We are also pashu, right? So we want to be adopted by a story. And these stories can be as outlandish and as stupid as one can imagine. And we as human beings are prepared to do anything, you know, kill people. You know, you had ISIS, you had other stuff. You have huge, gruesome stories, if you know of history, the New World or massacres. Why? For the sake of a story. These people thought they were doing whatever they were doing for the sake of a story. Or right now, this whole, this woke thing in America, madness in schools and in colleges, where they don't want anybody else who doesn't agree with what they think reality is like. So this is their story. They want only that story to be there. So this is how sadly the world works. Most human beings, and to come back to the whole question of AI and consciousness, the world works with humans almost like robots. So sometimes when people say, hey, what's going to happen? Well, we are already living not only now, because this moment is not a unique moment. You go back into history of all parts of the world, you'll see that this is how people have lived, excepting, in certain places, maybe in certain communities. And there are wise people, certainly, and we find a lot of them in India and in the West as well. And common people have a wisdom, and they can see through all this cant and nonsense. But sometimes they're afraid to stand up because there is a lot of penalty, and they might, in the four walls of their home, and say, hey, what's wrong with people? But to conform. So there's a lot of wisdom in the common man. And there is a lot of stupidity in the expert. Some of the greatest stupidity is in the academia. These are professors, they only know the equations, but equations is bookish knowledge. We are talking of intuition, which transcends these silos.
So are you suggesting that there could be a logical way to awaken intuition?
Yeah, well, practice. There are we were taught certain values that question yourself. First of all, okay, look at yoga, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, for example, which is also one way of connecting with this light within you. So the first two elements of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra are yama and niyama, which is ethical preparation. Because the greatest fog, if you're talking about this light, the greatest cause of this fog is ego. Because ego is something coming from mind upwards. So the more ahankar, the more ego you have, the fog thickens, and then you can't see it. And
in layman terms, by ego you just mean identities, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The more you think it's me, not that you and everybody else are the same. That's where things such as compassion come in. Compassion is to see others exactly like you, and so there are many different practices which wise people all over the world have enjoined others to partake of, or to be bound to, and they do lead to this freedom, and that freedom is what wisdom is. There is bookish knowledge. I'm all for bookish knowledge. I'm all for samskaras. Samskaras train you, they give you discipline, and they help you navigate. They are very important for navigating through life, but ultimately you have to go beyond. So samskaras are like saguna, you associate properties and things and that, but ultimately you have to transcend it. In the Yoga Sutras, it's called kaivalya, where you're alone, and how to approach that, because then all kinds of amazing things happen. You get access to capacities you did not know you possessed. So all of those things do happen.
Got it. Okay. You mentioned that something like this is possible based on how we define social structures and social practices. One of the elements being, let's say, morals. But don't you also think that over the years, what has led to evolution of society is largely based on belief systems? And belief systems, by its very definition, includes that we adhere to something not knowing whether it's objectively true or whether it's even relevant to us. And consequently, the belief system grows so strong, which eventually results in rather more forms of identities, be it religion, be it politics, be it political ideologies, be it the wokeism that you kind of mentioned. All of these are just extensions of just belief systems that are so strongly ingrained in us. So necessarily telling that, okay, practicing a certain emotional value, let's say be it compassion or be it hatred towards a certain community per se, or be it just the idea of curiosity alone, just practicing curiosity out of rigor, which is maybe I would argue most academicians do as part of their academic research. Don't you think it's just an additional form of binding that we discount?
Of course, when you look at academia, also the modern academy, the best universities, the best thinkers are always pushing at these boundaries. You have to be bound for academic rigor, because if you're not being rigorous, if you're not using critical thinking, then it's a slippery slope. So you have to have those boundaries, but nevertheless, at the same time, you have to see how these boundaries can be pushed. And that's what the best thinkers do in every field, whether you're talking about physics or, philosophy or neuroscience or every field. You are always asking questions. Is it appropriate to accept the framework as it is? And that's why ultimately all good research or breakthrough research is somebody comes from outside of the box and says, hey, the way you were looking at it was really not the right way. It was useful. We are not saying that previous work was not useful, but now you get a much better insight by looking at it from a totally different perspective. The light shine, this prakash that I mentioned, shines on it in a different way, and suddenly you understand things in a new way. So there is always a negotiation going on, and it should go on. So in other words, if you were to ask me, what should we do? I would say, yeah, you have to have universities, you have to have very strict disciplines, but you have to have a framework where there is freedom for this system to adapt and evolve, which was not the case with the way colleges and universities were set up in India for a long time. Maybe things are changing now, because somewhere in Delhi, they would decide, now this is what the curriculum is, and this is how you're going to teach this course or this subject or this subject. And that's all. That is sort of rote learning.
Mm-hmm.
That might be called what is in Sanskrit shiksha.
Mm-hmm.
But shiksha to vidya is a different thing. For vidya, you need shiksha to keep on adapting all the time. And for that, you have to have very nimble organization. And I can only hope that some of that change is going on. Now, within the American Academy, because the best universities are here, there are both kinds. The second tier, third tier scholars are the ones who are holding on to what has been told to them. And they're terrified of going beyond it, and they don't want others to challenge it. But the very best are questioning, and that's the way it should be. And that's the reason why, in spite of all the wokeism, etc., there's also challenges to it emerging. For example, look at the reaction to the COVID pandemic. The challenge is also to what the government and the CDC had done arose within the academia. And I'm happy to know that many of those guys were Indians, like J. Bhattacharya or Sunetra Gupta and Asim Malhotra and so on, who were not afraid to stand up, even though there was a cost to it. So there can be a cost, but you must keep on challenging. But at the same time, there must be boundaries. It's not that it's a chaos, free for all. No, there have got to be academic boundaries. People must have a framework for argument, for critical discussion, for negotiation of thoughts and ideas, but there must also be creative destruction of these boundaries.
Yeah, one thing that you mentioned is interesting is that there's maybe a top, X percentage, let it be 1 to 5% of, let's say, researchers or academicians who are willing to push these boundaries and are willing to accept facts or insights beyond what was ingrained within their thought process or belief system. But it's also true that the remaining, let's say part of the pyramid, the bottom of the pyramid is not willing to do that. But this might not be so much of a concern when we shift our attention to, let's say, a real society. When belief systems are so strong in society, how do you break those belief systems and ask them to, or at least incentivize or motivate them to seek truth?
Well, it's become easier now than before because of social media. Social media has dangers because a lot of false information can also propagate very quickly because of social media, but it also gives the tools that one needs for insights and valid information to be shared by a lot of people. Now, it's also true that most people do want true knowledge. See, most people, to use that metaphor again, want to see that light, no matter what culture they're from, no matter what their background. And sometimes they resist it, partly because they have a vested interest to hold on to what they've been told. They could be a part of a bureaucracy associated with the old paradigm. But by and large, if you don't push them, if you present knowledge in a non-threatening way, then people will adopt it. As example, I do travel quite a lot around the world. You find that in spite of the past 75 years of education in India, when India turned its back on its own knowledge tradition, right? And the main heart of this knowledge tradition is this understanding of consciousness, because Veda is Atma Vidya. It is the science of consciousness. In fact, everything, one can make the argument, within the Indian knowledge tradition or Indian tradition is associated with how to understand this in its different ways. And it's not just across kind of an objective knowledge, because we are a part of this knowledge. Our being itself expresses reality. So that's why a lot of very intricate questions related to how do we see ourselves and how do we transform ourselves come in, which is what all Indian tradition is about. But India turned its back on it. And in spite of that, look what happened. Some even semi-literate Indians, some much more knowledgeable, or yogis, went from India in personal capacity, fanned out to different corners of the world. And there is a yoga revolution. It's transformed the world. You can go to the smallest cities and corners in the free world, and you'll find, you go to highlands of Peru, you'll find these yoga studios. Of course, they start off with asanas, but ultimately asanas are supposed to take one to the whole question of, stretching of the breath, pranayama, or what is mind and what is this and that, which is ultimately the whole science of consciousness, right? So people want light, people want prakash, and this social media is what's going to make it accessible to people all across the world, and it's going to be world transforming in my view, because that is, consciousness is the ultimate frontier of science. We have understood to a fairly good degree how the outside world works, right? But we don't know at all how our inner cosmos works, which is the frontier of consciousness.
It's a very optimistic view, but although, don't you think the common perception is that social media is known to polarize people and their thoughts? Basically, more so because, let's say you have a certain belief or a thought process, social media and the algorithms are going to feed you more content, which will only make you more extreme into believing that it's true. That's point number one. And point number two, that you mentioned that, okay, for sure, yoga has now maybe penetrated through different geographies. And maybe there's more awareness about this tool itself, and maybe not the actual dynamics of it or the nuances of it. At least given social media, don't you think it has now become much more easier for these pseudo trained yogis to sort of come and dominate and propagate more of false information or incomplete information.
Absolutely. No, you're right. First of all, social media does polarize. That will happen because and another Vedic insight is that knowledge arises only out of conflict, out of tapas. Tapas is heat, which heat emerges out of conflict, emerges out of manthan. There is this samudra manthan, the idea of
churning out,
where the asuras, the churning of the ocean. Ocean is reality. The asuras are those identity, materiality, that reality is nothing but materiality. And the other is the devas are those who say there is consciousness which transcends. So there's got to be a churning, and that churning will go on. So, but social media will, you're right, it will probably sharpen it, but by sharpening it, it will hasten this process of communication of the deeper insights. So of course, one can always look at it either optimistically or pessimistically. One can always be afraid. That's what happens in any battlefield. In a battlefield, when you are out there on the field, you can die at any moment. So you can either feel that you're going to die the next moment, a missile is going to strike you, or if you are truly confident of what you're doing, then you don't care for any of that, and you will be sure that you will win. So I think that is indeed true. Now, as far as the false information is concerned, that's going to be a problem. And I think in reality, if I want to speak as a kind of a votary for the Indian view, because I, in my own heart, am convinced this is it. As a scientist, also as in fact, my recent research sort of bears it out. As a scientist, the huge crises that science is facing right now can only have a resolution if we bring in consciousness in. For example, just this morning, I got the final published form of a paper which finds or provides a resolution to the biggest crisis of physics, which is the 96% of missing reality, which is 68% of dark energy and 28% of dark matter. No evidence whatsoever for it, 96%. But physics is living with it. So by approaching the problem somewhat differently, inspired by some Vedic ideas, I don't, of course, mention any of that in my paper, one is able to provide a resolution to this puzzle. I'll be happy to send you a copy of this paper after.
For sure, I would love to read it. Yeah.
I think the crises that exist right now are crises related to missing consciousness. In fact, consciousness or mind has played a role in all of science over the past 150 years. Go back to Einstein. Before that, Newtonian physics. You have only objects, right? Although the observer, the laws of physics, the observer is somehow placed beyond the objects, but you have only objects and they are interacting with each other. Mechanical universe, right? And then Einstein said, well, there is a problem. The problem is, why is it that two different observers, one of which is moving with respect to the other, the speed of light is the same. So threw in a complication into this. Then came along quantum mechanics, where why is it that if in the micro world you have a superposition of all possibilities, the moment your mind interacts with it, you have access to only one, right? Which Schrödinger says the idea for that came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, that this Atman, this micro thing, is the Brahman, has a possibility of everything that there is in the entire cosmos within it. It's a superposition of all possibilities. But to the mind is mechanical. To the mind, only one of those possibilities is accessible. In fact, this is These two are the two foundational ideas of quantum mechanics, or everything else follows from it, right? It postulates of quantum mechanics. So, so mind has been brought in, but only hesitatingly. Now, more physics, cosmology, you have black hole physics or Hawking radiation. The moment you're talking of information paradox in cosmos, information or entropy are both mind ideas. Information is not a property of an object. An object doesn't have information. Information is a property of a collection, of a mind, right? So entropy and all these concepts are in, but most scientists who do this are not aware of the deeper understanding of this thing, what entropy is. They're only using formulas mechanically. Okay, here is H rho, which is entropy, and how do we play around with it? Maybe we'll get something else. And then you have this paradox or that paradox or entanglement, that this object is entangled with another object a billion miles away, right? But you don't understand that at all. So I say that the advancement in science itself are going to free the human mind as the central role of mind and consciousness, and the distinction between the two, which we are also getting from neuroscience experiments themselves. The famous experiment of Libet, that normally where we believe that our conscious decisions are being taken, activity related to that already builds up in the motor cortex a few hundred milliseconds prior to that. So this could be, a false sense that you're free. But that freedom, so to a certain extent, and this is a huge paradox, and people are writing books on it, that are we zombies? We think we are free, but we are really not free. So I say people who are working on this, the best of them are aware of this idea of consciousness being as something transcendent. Para in the Vedas or the Upanishads, you talk about apara and para. Apara is material reality. Para is the transcending consciousness. And so this is going to inform understanding in the academia increasingly, and ultimately it will filter out through the social media in a very rapid pace to the average guy. And that's going to ultimately call for a fundamental change in society, every part of the world. Everybody wants knowledge. Prakash, I was at a big meeting in Delhi 2 or 3 years ago, and one of the speakers there was this very charming lady from Saudi Arabia, who's a yogacharya in Saudi Arabia, and she's very influential. And her life-transforming event was that she had some acute illness as a child, and then she did asanas, etc., and that healed her. She had gone to all the doctors, and then she's become a great evangelist, if you will, for yoga, and it's accepted. She's gotten Saudi Arabia to accept yoga as a part of the school curriculum through sports. She knows, she's also a sensible lady. She knows that there would be opposition from the religious people. So there is more opposition, sadly, to these ideas in India because of colonialism, because of the way of our experience the past couple of 100 years or maybe longer. But these are irresistible ideas, because ultimately everybody wants to see the sunlight, sun as a metaphor or as a reality. Everybody wants it.
Okay, just a hypothetical scenario here. Okay, assume, let's say, in 25, 30 years or 50 or even 100 years, there's a certain day when more than 50% of the global population of human beings have sort of received this particular light, metaphorically, that you're speaking about. And what do you think the world looks like then? What does it result into? What is the consequence of that?
Okay, first of all, we have to see that the world is going through the most disruptive change ever. Because of AI, pervasive automation, the world doesn't need 8 billion people anymore.
Right.
The population of the world is going to collapse, in my view, to maybe less than 1 billion. And that process has already started in countries like South Korea, where fertility rate has dropped to only 0.8. You need 2.1 children per woman for population to remain stable. There it's dropped to 0.81. India also, it's dropped just below 2.1. Of course, because of the women who are already in the childbearing stage, it'll keep on increasing for some more time. China, it has already started shrinking. Population all over the world will go down. Next 100 years. So over the next 100 years, there will be the most astonishing changes taking place in society, in the economies, because as populations shrink, the drivers that you have for economic growth will not exist. Everything will have to be re-envisioned. And then, as most people accept, India, in terms of gross domestic product, GDP, will, in the next 20, 25 years, will be number one. Right now, in PPP terms, it's third. China, US, and India. It will overtake US in the next dozen years, and China in the next 20 odd years. So things will be changed. The populations will shrink. There would be, perhaps things will be more livable. There won't be that many jobs needed. Computers will do most stuff. So perhaps there will be a lot of people, it'll be more of a kind of a Gurukul thing. These universities, brick and mortar universities will go, most of them. There'll be a few. There'll be more of one-on-one education, maybe a kind of a Gurukul idea. If you use modern terms for it, there'll be more life coaches. Everybody will have some other person advising them. So this is how the world would be. As to what it will do to society, I don't know. Perhaps there would be return to nature. People would want to leave cities with all their pollution. I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to use the crystal ball, but the most astonishing changes that one can imagine are going to take place in the world, all across the world. And the belief systems that people have held on to for a long time will all be jettisoned, because these are stories. They may have worked in the past. Now, once somebody has seen light, everybody would want to go to that room where light is. And that light exists within each individual, because that light, that Atman as Prakasha, or Shiva as Prakasha, or Vishnu, or whatever, Ishvara, exists within each individual, between each prani, between each sentient being, even animals. See, right now, look, America or the West is a place of horrors. You look at these farms, animal farms, cattle farms, the way they are raised, they can't even move. They are injected with steroids, fattened, slaughtered. These chicken, made the moment eggs hatch, the male chicks, they are ground through grinders and fed back to the female chicks, because they want these chicks as egg-producing factories. So people will question all of that. And who knows, we may be able to, in some sense, communicate with animals also in a more vital way and treat them as a part of this reality in which we are all, each animal expresses a part of this magic of reality. So I see it in, maybe I'm an optimist, I see it in optimistic terms. I see the impending collapse of the population and all this climatism, etc. That's all. This is another part of the wokeism religion. That's not what's going to happen. Populations will collapse. So this whole problem of human disruption of the climate or the crisis will not be the big story. That will recede into the background.
Very interesting. I agree with you based on extrapolative research that we have today. The population is bound to decline at least by the end of this century. But with newer or let's say advancements in genetic science, as well as biology in general, tissue culture and things like that, don't you think with the advent of things like you can create these sort of incubating pods where you can allow for artificial fertilization of, let's say, the human cells, and allow it to be incubated there and grow there? So basically, and you're also able to, let's say, genetically program the behavior, the physical, mental, emotional, all the behaviors of that particular being that's going to come out. And that would naturally mean you can also program longer life and better health and things like that. So mortality rate, if any, should theoretically go down.
Right. Yeah, totally agree. And that's a very fascinating frontier. I was talking to a friend just the other day. Imagine, due to advances in biology, and this is, of course, something that had been foreseen by the great English author Aldous Huxley in his book, The Brave New World. And as you know, Aldous Huxley was a Vedantin. Instead of using the word Sanatan Dharma, he used the word perennial philosophy so that it'll be more acceptable to the reader in the West. So he visualized these pods, right? Babies being born. And of course, he viewed them as alphas and betas and gammas and deltas, because at that time, the idea of robots doing a lot of the work was not so clear. And people thought that maybe you still needed, brawn power. You needed deltas as well. But now we can imagine a situation where machines do most of this stuff. And you can also imagine, and yeah, the story, what I was discussing with a friend, because of biology, if people can choose what we need to look like, there could be an ideal. And if every child that is born conforms to that ideal, this perfect body, right, then what will be the distinction? And our memories can be controlled, by or are a function of what we have seen in. And if you and I look exactly the same, and everybody else also looks exactly the same, then what is the meaning of identity? There are all these crises that are going to come because people will use biotechnology the moment it becomes available. You can't resist, you can't stop it. Right now, they might say, ethical reasons, we can't do this or do that. Ultimately, that will happen. And all that will take us to the centrality of existence, according to Vedanta, which is consciousness. Centrality. The moment you say, aham brahmasmi, the whole cosmos is within me, is because that consciousness is within you as well. Or I am Atma Brahm, right? Or in Kashmir Shaivism, Chaitanya Atma, this awareness or consciousness itself is Atma. So I think it will bring about, and biology will be a big driver, because the changes taking place through biology are so much more, central to our very being, because then we have access to all those changes. And now, as populations go down, just look at South Korea again. Just think about it. 0.81 fertility rate. And South Koreans are very smart people. They're good-looking people, they're smart people. But they don't want to have children because of whatever reason. Our society is telling us that you have to keep on doing things. So you are doing things. And then there's no time for it. And of course, in the West, in the United States, raising children is so expensive. If you're working, your wife is working, you have a baby, you need a nanny. The nanny probably makes more money than an assistant professor in a college. You have to pay the nanny about $70,000-$80,000 a year. You send them to college, $100,000 a year. And most people do arts, history of art, education, or philosophy. There are no jobs for any of that. So you've already taken $400,000 as debt. 4 years of college. There are no jobs at all. There are really no jobs. There are jobs for college professors, but that's artificial. You don't need all these colleges. You can use media now. You have just a few studios. You can beam all your classes to every corner of the world. Why do you need 1 million professors? Maybe you need just a few hundred, right? So most far-reaching changes. I think that those people, no matter what corner of the world, who are more in touch with their being, and their being the consciousness aspect of their self, and also in touch with the outer reality, which we must be, because we have both these aspects, asura, asuric, and the sura. Both these aspects, those are in touch, they will show the way to the rest of the world.
Very, very intriguing. But this is also a dichotomy of AI, right? Like from an economic standpoint, you want the population to increase for the economies to grow, for more labor and participation, and for capital to make sense. And even when we speak about it from the standpoint of AI, sure, let's say that there's a bunch of super smart engineers who come up with the best AI-enabled tech and robots and stuff. But at the end of the day, any of these would make sense only if there are people to use it. And the only way to make it more affordable for people is if there are a lot more people who can pay smaller chunks of money to afford it. So at the end of the day, populations, and I see this as a dichotomy where you need a growing population for any of these advancements to make sense. But at the same time, population is perhaps the most limiting factor that allows, that rather prevents the success of any of these.
No, I don't. I would agree with you that you need growing population for these innovations to make sense, because just look at South Korea once again. They need more AI because they don't have children coming in. They have very few children coming in the next generation. They need more AI to take care of the older population. Or China also. China is aging very rapidly. So is Japan. And the same process has begun in most of India, including South India. Most of South India, the fertility rate has dropped below 2. 1.8 or something.
Yeah.
Most of South India. The only two states where it's above 2.1 right now are Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. So it is happening in India as well. So you need more technology then for, why did you need a lot of children in the past? Because the parents wanted these children to take care of them when they became old, right? Now, when you don't have children, you'll need more of technology. So you need more of AI. So I say falling populations would be a driver for more innovation in different aspects of
so is the critical factor here is that the cost of affording AI is going to be much lower than the cost of raising and bearing a kid?
Oh, absolutely. Because AI can be replicated very quickly, right? In foundries, while kids is such a slow process. It's you have to change diapers. That's a tough process of 2 years.
Yeah.
They don't listen. And then these kids, when they grow up, they don't listen to their parents.
Yeah, fair enough. I get the point. Okay, but going back to the discussion on consciousness, right? Okay, so let's establish for a second that consciousness is transcendental, and let's start out from that. And then we're speaking of a physical realm as a mutually exclusive realm, or an independent realm, so to speak, right? Where the activities can be affected by consciousness, but consciousness can exist without the physical realm. So what allows the existence of, or what leads to the existence of the physical realm in that first place? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay. In the Vedantic world, in such an amazing world, I can't tell you how extraordinary the Indian tradition is. Having spent many, many years doing this stuff, there's nothing in the entire world literature to the kind of discussions and things that have taken place in India, and asking all these questions, of which we Indians are now totally unaware. All these questions were asked, and they should be asked, and they should be raised. Well, first of all, the question of, for example, how does consciousness interact with the physical world? If they are separate, if consciousness is not a material property, then it cannot influence the material world, right? Right? If the observer and the observed are different, then what observer does in his mind should not have any influence on the observed, right? It's a very valid question to ask. So this was asked in Vedantic circles, and in fact, go back 2,000 years or prior. And a lot of what we have in Indian art addresses this question. But just to provide you a short summary of it, the answer is that what is called Drishti Srishti Vada. Drishti meaning observation, Srishti means creation. That consciousness through observation creates, because otherwise you don't need, if there is physical reality and that has its own laws, which in Sanskrit is called Rita or Ritam, then where is the place of consciousness? There's no place for consciousness, right? Because the physical universe will keep on evolving as by laws, and the Indian tradition accepts that there are physical laws, right? So the consciousness through observation creates. Now, what does that really mean? My good friend, the great Malayali Indian physicist who passed away 2-3 years ago, George Sudarshan, wrote a very famous paper on it in the 1970s, along with his student, Misra, and it's called the quantum Zeno effect, where he showed that by observation alone, the observer can steer the state of a quantum system, right? Either freeze it or steer it. And this quantum Zeno effect has been demonstrated in many different labs. It shows how not only freeze the state, you can steer it whichever way you want, that how the two interact. And in the Vedic tradition, Shiva through observation, have you seen in Bengal, you have Durga Puja, right? You have the puja. You in puja, you see the goddess Kali. Kali represents time and represents the physical universe. Dances over a prone Shiva. So Shiva by itself consciousness cannot be accessed. So all that you access is reality.
True consciousness.
Is physical processes. Or are you aware something which is very popular in esoteric circles or Vedantic circles in South India is something called Sri Vidya. Are you aware of Sri Vidya?
Very well, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, in Sri Vidya represents the physical cosmos, right? And the goddesses. And the infinitesimal point in the middle is Shiva, which means that the more you look for Shiva, you don't find it. It always disappears under various veils of materiality. So because Shiva is not an object, it's the experiencing subject, right? It's not accessible to language. So what we will become clearer and clearer through all this, that we will find amazing new ways of uncovering aspects of materiality, which is Prakriti, which is the goddess, right? Or which is Sri Vidya. The various triangles represent different doorways into deeper aspects of prajna, of intuition. So I think it'll also be a revolutionary phase in our understanding of the inner cosmos. And that would be a great, just as the past 400-500 years, when the Europeans went out to far corners of the world on their sailboats and discovered these physical lands, so beautiful lands, Australia, New Zealand, Americas, this and that. The next 50-100 years would be sailboats to the inner cosmos, discovery of different lands, which will provide that meaning and sustenance, meaning for sustenance in life. Which would be wonderful. And maybe that's where we need some startups to accelerate this process through this fog that social media also has the potential to create.
How exactly? Can you elaborate a bit on that? What should a startup do?
As I said before, the university is dead. College is dead. Why is the college and the university dead? Well, we needed them 50 years ago when they were the places where libraries existed. You needed to go to the college and the university to get access to libraries, to knowledge, because books were the repositories of knowledge as was known until that moment, right? So you needed it. And you attended courses and you got access, you got a library card, and you could do this. Now, all this knowledge and much more is accessible to each one of us at our fingertips, right? So what are colleges for? Right now, they're only being used for credentialing. Okay, you've gone through social thing, you've made friends, you have networked, which is what schools, the expensive schools are for, getting to network with people from privileged families who would be helpful to you later on, right?
Right.
So really, you don't need colleges and universities. Of course, you need socialization. And 4 years of college are a great place to make friends and meet people of the opposite sex and so on, and get married and whatever, and start your own life. If you do, but people really don't do that. They just have a wild time, most often right now, right? Okay, so if you don't need that, you need a startup now to address, which I think is the most fundamental problem, where the greatest crisis in modern life is, which is the pointlessness of the college and the university. So we could probably, or what one would need is a new way of credentialing and accessing curated information, because you were perfectly right to say that a lot of the stuff on the internet is nonsense, is hogwash, is stupid, right? So how do we tell people what is good knowledge and not so good knowledge? Now, the problem with the academy is that because of the silo system, people just want to teach only what they know. They only want to teach, if psychology, they only want to tell you that the body is like a machine. That's what formal psychology is all about. There's no place for consciousness for the subject in psychology, which is, or you look at allopathic medicine, where the body, you can only deal with symptoms. You can only deal with symptoms. And allopathic medicine has a huge crisis right now. 70 to 90% of all this clinical research cannot be replicated. This is the big clinical, crisis, replication crisis of allopathic medicine. So you have to look at the body itself as an ecological system. So you need a new medicine, right? Maybe Ayurveda, of course, it's got to be modernized. You can't just be talking about those samhitas that have come down to us. You have to totally be in modern space. So you need startup for medicine, because medicine is a huge crisis. You look at how many more people died in countries which relied only on allopathic medicine to deal with COVID, 100 times more than those which used, common sense, or let's deal with symptoms as they come along, because medicine in the West has become too bureaucratized, right? So you need a startup for that. And as to how to go about doing it, I don't know. Maybe to rejuvenate Ayurveda, make it modern once again, because we need a new, even if you didn't want to use the word Ayurveda, you need a new system to deal with health, which is adaptive, which looks at the body as an ecosystem, ecological system, in harmony with the rest of the world, right? Because the outside effects also come. Then you need education by itself as a ecosystem. So maybe to begin with a hybrid system where a lot of the content is provided through the internet, but people also need to get together from time to time as a transitional phase. That could be the biggest thing, I think, and that could be a game changer, not only in India, but all across the world, because such a system, people would be able to access information everywhere, in all corners of the world. So these are two, because what do? We need education, that is brahmacharya. We need education, we need food, etc. That, of course, robots will provide to us. Then we need to deal with problems of health. So you need startups to deal with health. And then you need life coaches. Well, that could be a part of the education, your Gurukulam on the internet. So these could be game changers across the world, in my view.
Okay, if you were to, let's say, build out an AI model that were to curate content to filter out, let's say, stuff that is bogus and nonsense across the internet, what do you think this AI model should optimize for? What would be the parameters that it would optimize for?
Well, if you look at the experience of Twitter or YouTube and so on, what they're doing is they have a lot of people, they just want to throw out stuff which is not considered acceptable to the deep state. For example, Twitter, they wanted to throw out everything, even doctors, even if it were the best doctors,
Right.
saying that, look, hold on, hold off, maybe it's got to be viewed differently. They were just banned, right? This is this system right now. So that is not acceptable. That's, or they're using certain keywords. You look at YouTube, they use certain keywords. If they find these keywords, they will throw out or Facebook, they'll just throw out your content. So AI models ultimately, what is AI? AI is only pattern recognition. It doesn't have any intelligence of itself. So pattern recognition models which are adaptive. So you need pattern recognition models which are adaptive, where ultimately you need some human supervision. That is the kind of a system that you need. It can't be a totally algorithm-driven model. I think what they are doing right now is depending only on algorithm-driven model, like Chat GPT, right? And ultimately it becomes very hollow. Once you have seen through it, you're only looking at, okay, these semantics or proper structures, and they make sense because you've looked at all possible phrases which hang together, and then you reproduce them. But that has limitations. But to go back to your question, you need a hierarchical system where you need agency to keep on adaptively transforming, but some individuals will have to take those decisions related to how that adaptation is made to proceed in a sensible way.
I get it, but still, just curious to understand what would be the parameter that we optimize for. Like, how do we, let's say, quantify or objectify bogusness, or how do we objectify irrelevance?
Well, sometimes it's easy to do it because there are certain things which are so stupid. Everybody knows that they are stupid, excepting those people who live in those bubbles who are emotionally attached to that content. For example, let's just talk of religion because it's easy to do it. Those people who believe in creationism in the West, right? Or people who look at literalism, they look at stuff associated with 72 virgins in heaven or something like that. There's some stuff which is so obviously bogus, so it's easy to pick that out. But there are certain things which are much more contested. And if they are contested and there are people both in the academy saying both this and that, then both of that should be allowed in. And that's where the deep state in the United States was wrong by saying that anybody who questions the effectiveness, the claimed effectiveness of the mRNA vaccines is an anti-vaxxer. He should be thrown out, if not into a dungeon. He should be pushed out of Twitter, of all social media. That was obviously wrong, because these were legitimate questions related to what these vaccines could do. If it was a kind of a genetic therapy, gene therapy, then why weren't the risk factors associated with this kind of gene therapy taken into consideration? Those are very valid questions. So I think you've got to give room to dissenting views. Dissenting views, maybe from the academy itself, but you can't shut out people completely, as is happening amongst the woke circles. That's like blasphemy. It's an old idea which goes back to, let's say, the rise of Christianity. You can't blaspheme. If you're doing blasphemy, then you're going to be burnt at stake. Like witches. According to some estimates, as many as 2 million bright women were burnt at stake just because they questioned the prevailing views at that time. Some in Goa as well. So not everything is fake. A lot of what is being questioned is fine. So broad river. It should be a broad river.
So you're suggesting decentralization of media is actually a solution to get rid of much of the nonsense?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. Okay. I maybe, switch gears here. There's something I've been wanting to speak to you since I've been reading your Medium columns for quite some years now. And I've also listened to much of the talks where you speak of significance of, let's say, some numbers in the Indian tradition, be it a 1017 or a 339 or a 108 or even 9, 12. And there are many of these numbers we can speak about. I understand and agree with why each of those numbers are relevant and make sense. But one thing I do not understand is when most of these representations or understandings are very symbolic in nature, what does symbolism have to do with its physical manifestation? Like, just because I do something, let's say X number of times, where X is a symbolic number, it need not mean anything in the physical world, in the energy plane. Why does symbolism even make sense?
Very, very good question. Very good question. Okay, let's just talk of the number 108. And as you know, I wrote a book on it called The Astronomical Code of the Rig Veda, which was published 30 years ago. 108 number, in my view, looking at the very organization of the Rig Veda and other Vedic texts, express the knowledge that the Vedic rishis possessed, and that knowledge was obtainable based on simple experiments that could be performed, that the earth, that the sun and the moon were both 108 times their respective diameters from the earth, right? So the inner sun is symbolically 108 times away from the earth, which is your body. So you have a japamala, you have 108 beads. So you're making a symbolic journey from your body to the inner sun. So now the question of symbolism. Now, why are you doing it? Why should that be important? Why should repeating some mantra 108 times be important? Very valid question. How I see this is more from the perspective of discipline. That it's like, why, right now in India, because India is such a crazy place, especially because of the madness of its Anglosphere, that if somebody says, I'm a vegetarian, then people say that is a horrible thing. You are making people who are non-vegetarian feel uncomfortable. So don't say a restaurant should not announce that it's a vegetarian restaurant, even though there are restaurants in the West which have on their boards, we are a vegetarian restaurant. So I have nothing against people who are non-vegetarian, fine, because we're also a food chain. A big fish must eat a smaller fish in the sea in order to survive. So if you're eating, or you're a soldier, you're in the jungle, you have to survive, you're fighting a war, you must eat animals, otherwise you will not exist, right? So perfectly fine. I have nothing against non-vegetarians or non-vegetarianism. Or if somebody fasts for a day. When I was a kid, I didn't understand why somebody should fast. These things are all a question of self-discipline. You don't eat something that's a question of self-discipline. Self-discipline is a good thing, ultimately. These are all arbitrary things. So if you're doing something, that in itself is not going to give you anything. But the self-discipline that goes with it, it will help you lift that fog, which covers that light. That's how I see it. So, in other words, you don't have to do any of this symbolism. You don't have to do any mantra. You don't have to you can eat whatever you want, right? But so long as you have self-discipline in navigating both the outer cosmos and the inner cosmos, you're fine. So that's the way I look at it.
So you're telling it's basically rigour, it's hatha.
Right.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's maybe the first time I've heard someone give out that perspective. Usually it's more trying to justify why the number itself makes much more.
Yeah, Anupai. This is called Anupai. In Kashmir Shaivism, it's called Anupai. You have Anavapaya, where you are doing these things. You're doing this particular ritual, or you're doing this mantra 108 times, or this or that. And of course, while you're trying to do it, you're bored, or all these ideas thought to come to it, and you fall asleep, or this or that, or you're doing it mechanically, right? And for some, it could be total concentration, and then those people. But for that, they have to possibly be gifted. There are people who are born with certain temperament. There are some who are able to focus much more easily than some others, as we know, right? But by itself, whether you do this or that, in my view, makes no fundamental difference. And it's truly, I truly believe in it. It's all a question of that yama and niyamas, those self-discipline to help you firstly reduce that part of the fog which comes from your ego, which I think is really the central problem, even in scientific research. Ultimately, you have to let go. Famous book by Jacques Hadamard, The Logic of Mathematical Invention or something, where these scientists claimed that most of their discoveries came sort of spontaneously. And that's how it happens, spontaneously, kind of a epiphany, which points to the fact that it's not analytical thinking, logical thinking, which takes you to the next step. But to come back, okay, this most recent paper, of which I'll send you a copy at the end of this talk, shows why the current idea of, because this accelerating universe, so the universe will die a cold death. All the stars will keep on moving away, and then there will be nothing. Makes no sense. Where did this all come from? Why will it end? So this paper shows how ultimately this expansion will reverse, this acceleration will reverse, and it will go back as in the cyclic universe, or as is the view in the Srishti Pralaya models that we have from the Puranas.
Are you familiar with Paul Steinhardt's work on endless universe?
Yeah.
I think it talks about a similar theory. I've read the book. I had also emailed Paul Steinhardt asking him to be on my podcast, but he wants to be on podcasts of just familiar people, so couldn't get him.
I'm aware of that work, but that work is not considered mainstream anymore because of this whole thing about the accelerating universe, etc. That's come up. So it's sort of on the fringe, but yeah, I'm aware of it.
Right. So how does that theory tie with your explanation?
My explanation comes from, it's a very interesting history to it. 7 years ago, I wrote a book. I translated the Vaisheshik Sutras, and it's a book that is easily available. It's called Matter and Mind. And there I was astonished. First of all, 500 BCE, it has 2 of the 3 laws of motion of Newton in it, including to every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Exactly the same phraseology. Karya Virodhi Karma. To action. Karya is action, Virodhi is reaction, karma. There is a reaction to every action. Yeah, there's an equal opposite reaction. Okay. So there I discovered that what he stated, that Vik and Kala, which is space and time, directionality and time, are creations of the mind. He gives a whole structure, which please do read it.
For sure.
Yeah, I have a summary of it in one of my Medium essays. So the 3-dimensional frame of reality, which goes back to Descartes, is a convention. So 3 years ago, I questioned it based on some work on logic, and I proposed a theory that, based on a mathematical theorem, that space is E-dimensional and not 3-dimensional. And the moment you accept it's e-dimensional, one of the consequences is that gravitation is a consequence of e-dimensionality. Gravitation is an unexplained force. It's not being unified with the other forces. So it emerges as a consequence of non-integer dimensionality of space. Okay, now that's one. The other consequence of it is that you have fractal structures in space, okay, that the same structures repeat at different scales. And then another consequence of this is that Big Bang is a explosion of dimensionality. It starts with 0, and then it's moving towards E, and that explains all the different phases that we see in cosmos. Now, we, with a compatriot, we wrote a paper, a longish paper on it, which appeared in Physics Essays 2 or 3 months ago. But this most recent paper, which just appeared this morning, shows why, because of this E-dimensionality, ultimately, and that's something that Paul Steinhardt, this is a new theory, okay, where that space ultimately this will the acceleration will reverse, mm-hmm, and then we'll go back to where we started out from.
So you're telling that everything is going to reduce to a point of singularity and again grow up from there.
Well, I don't say that because that's outside of the scope of this particular paper, but that's where Steinhardt's work argues. Yeah, and that could happen, yes.
Very interesting. Okay, what if you were a 22, 23, 24-year-old out of college, what would you be doing today?
If I was a 22-year-old out of college, I'll seize all the great opportunities that lie ahead. The next 50, 100 years are going to be the most amazing and astonishing part of human history, part of freedom. In some sense, if you look at that yoga theory, from Krita to Treta to Dwapar to Kali, yeah, we are probably making a transition into another golden age, another Krita age. So this is a time where a young person has all the opportunities to seize. Carpe diem is a Latin phrase, seize the day. To seize the day. To seize the day to transform the world. This is a golden time of history, the best time of history, in my view. And because it's the greatest time of history, there's also going to be all kinds of amazing, astonishing things happening. Not just one bank failing, maybe, cascade of banks failing, maybe an economic crisis, but it's only out of huge crises that great opportunities emerge.
Yeah, very interesting. I think it's just a matter of perspective that you look at it from a fun angle and it turns out fun.
Right.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thanks a lot for doing this very super fascinating conversation. I totally enjoyed this.
Thank you, Krishna. Great to be a part of your podcast, and the very best to you.